Are you looking to get beautiful, bold, rich, vibrant colors in your watercolor painting? Welcome to Sunlit Brushstrokes. My name is Jessica, and I'm excited to share with you my top tips for how I achieve vibrant color. A viewer recently asked me how I get such concentrated, rich mixtures in my little flower palettes here, and it's a great question. I think one that a lot of people can struggle with. And I realized that my answer actually depends on whether I'm working wet on wet or wet on dry. Because I most often work wet on wet, I'm going to be sharing those tips with you today. But I'll share my tips for making color mixtures when I work wet on dry in a future video. If you'd like to watch me paint this entire painting from the very beginning until the end, you can find that in my Etsy shop, and I'll include a link for that in the description below. The full-length video will include the outline. I hope my tips today help you create bolder, richer colors in your own work. Let's go ahead and get started. So I went ahead and transferred my image here of flowers onto a sheet of 140-pound cold pressed arch watercolor paper. If you'd like to see how I went about tracing this image, I do have videos on how to do that, so I'll include a link to that in the description below. But otherwise, you can just go ahead, transfer your image onto your paper, and we're gonna go ahead and start painting. I have mostly my M. Graham watercolor paint today. I also have a core quinacridone magenta that I'm going to be using, and so that's what I have for paint. And my purpose of today's video is to really just show you guys kind of how I go about my paint to water ratios when I'm working wet on wet. I'm going to do a video where I work more of the wet on dry techniques, and I'm going to show you how I do the paint to water ratio there too. It changes up a little tiny bit because in this case, we're going to have water on our paper already. That's going to mean we can work with more concentrated paint in our palettes. And my purpose today is to really give you a peek into what happens on my palettes. You guys have asked me some questions about my palettes, and so that is what I want to talk about today and really talk about water to paint ratio. Now, I don't tend to think about paint ratios in terms of like the tea, milk, butter, all that. I know that can be helpful for some people. I think I just tend to think about it in light and dark. And so when I want to have a light color, I put the lighter colors, which means more water. When I want darker colors, we're going to get less water, more paint. And so we have a blend today. Clearly, you can see we've got some pure whites happening in these flowers. And we have some very, very dark blacks happening back here. So we're gonna get to have the full range of pigments and ratios here. Now, my first tip is to work from light to dark. And working from light to dark means your first layers have more water. And then as you carry on through the painting, you're gonna be using less water and more paint. So we're gonna work on our lightest values first. And so what I wanna do is mix up a color for, if you look in the reference photo here, you'll see some very kind of soft light purple. Now, purple isn't always the color I would start with, but because it's such a nice soft light purple and our pinks are so intense, I'm thinking to start with the light purple. So I don't always start with purple because it's kind of a cool tone color, which I've talked about before, and I'll talk about it more another day, but I do typically start with warmer colors. But today we're gonna mix up a nice soft light purple. So I've got my palette here. So I have not added any water to this yet today. You can see there is a bit of shine in some of my paint, and that's because I use M. Graham for most of my paint, and it has a little bit of honey in it, which actually keeps things semi-moist, and that's why things almost look like they are wet. But if you have something like in this case, this is the core I mentioned, you can see it doesn't have as much shine. But whatever the case, I do let my paint fully dry in my palettes. I went ahead and cleaned out one of these wells so that I can use it for a fresh paint mixture. Now, to do that, I basically just scooped my bluey purple color that I had in here. I just scooped it out and put it in this well. I could have used it, but I decided, you know what? I think when I made that purple there, that I had quinacridone rose rather than quinacridone magenta. And to keep things more simple, I'll just use quinacridone magenta plus my phthalo blue. So I'm going to start with that. So I have not added water to this or this yet. I just have some water on my brush. You can see now there's paint on it too, but I'm just going to take some of my phthalo blue and just mix it into here. It's very concentrated so far. You can probably tell that. Add a little more water, a little more paint, and then I'm going to add my magenta. Usually I actually start with the magenta before the blue, but I'm working with a little bit of both colors here, and I am, like you can see, fairly concentrated. So I just washed my brush. I'm coming back in and I'm mixing some of this magenta color into my blue. So I've got a beautiful, beautiful purple right now. Let's see how it looks. This is super concentrated. We don't want it this concentrated, and we would not want to work wet on dry with such dark purple. Because I'm working wet on wet, I could decide to use it that dark if I wanted to, but because the water, right? If I work wet on wet, the water will end up making that a little bit lighter. We can try that. Sometimes I might water things down even more than that. Let's just add a tiny little bit more water. So you can see how I added my water. I just dip the brush in, rub it against the side of the palette, mix it. It's still pretty concentrated, but let's take a go at that and see. Sometimes I don't even always know exactly what I want until I actually get it on the painting. And so that is the second tip. When you're working wet on wet, you want to work with more concentrated paint than you would if you're working wet on dry. All right, so we're ready to start applying our water, and I'm gonna just be using a basic, you can use any brush. These Artegria ones hold a little bit more water than my Simply Simmons, so I'll probably use this for adding the water. And all I really wanna do is just pay attention to where I'm gonna be applying that kind of purpley shadow color, and I'm gonna work left to right. And we're gonna discuss the water to paint ratio depending on the shape I work on. So we're gonna start out with, you know, this first shape here doesn't have a whole lot of that purpley color, but I see a little bit of it, and it's almost hard-edged enough that I'll come back and do that after, and I'll show you how I do it because I'm gonna work a little bit wet on dry. There's wet on dry there. So I'm gonna just come in and wet this shape, and let's just go ahead and wet this entire flower. Besides this first petal, we'll leave it dry, but we'll wet everything else. All right, then we're gonna start by dropping in some of our colors. So I have here, just gonna move this a little bit, it's creating a shadow. I'm gonna dab my brush off a little bit. So I've got this beautiful purple color we made, and it's very concentrated. If I was to come on, as you know, wet on dry, we'd get a deep dark color like that. We definitely don't want that. But because we've got water on here already, I think we'll be okay with what we have. Let's just test it. Yeah, I actually don't mind that color. It's pretty soft, and that's what I'm after. And like I say, I usually would put the purple on later, but because it's such a soft purple and we have such a vibrant pink, I think I'm gonna do it this way, which is it's a little bit reverse from how I would often work, but we're gonna give it a go. So I'm moving my brush, as you can see, kind of in the direction of the creases and the folds of this flower. And in some places, I need a little bit more, so you can see when it starts to get too light, just gonna dip into my paint. I'm not dipping into my water. We're gonna try this again. I might have to dry my brush a little. Let's see how this goes on. Oh no, we're concentrated enough. So I'm just gonna put a little bit more of that. We can actually get a lot darker over here. I could decide if I wanna get darker. One thing I can do, if my paint isn't concentrated enough, it could be that I have a lot of water on my brush, and I can try by squeezing the ferrule first, like this. So basically the bristle's close to the ferrule, and it will pull out some of the water and less paint. The paint is hopefully still in the tips of the bristles. And I can see if I can go a little darker here. And if I'm still not happy with that, I could let this dry a smidgen more rather than have to make more paint. I don't think I want to have to make more paint. So you can see it's going a little darker. Let's move on. We can come back to that later and always do a little bit of wet on dry if we want to. So I'm just going to drop a little bit of this color over here. You can see I'm getting more detail because the paper's starting to dry a bit. Still, it's clearly wet on wet. And there are hard edge shapes up here, but that's okay. I'm just going to let them be soft for now. And that's what I'm going to go ahead and do for this flower. So I'll repeat those steps as I walk my way through these other flowers. Okay, so my first layer is dry. We want that first layer dry because when we go in with the next layer, even though we're going to be wetting again and working wet on wet, if we don't dry this first, that purple will start moving around on us when we try and put our pinks. And so I've gone ahead, dried everything, but I'll be repeating those steps, wetting and then adding the color. And since these pinks are a darker tone, we can use them more concentrated even than what our purple was. So we're gonna decide how much water we even need to add to our palette. What I've done here is you can see, okay, we have a bit of water in there because of making our purple, but here it's pretty much dry. In here, it's kind of bone dry. And then I put a little bit of fresh magenta in there so that we can experiment. Sometimes you'll want to get straight paint out of the tube when you're working. Maybe you don't have any dry paint or clean paint in your palette. And so you might want to take paint straight out of the tube, or you might have dried paint in your palette. So I'm going to show you working both ways, but we will be working wet on wet as we did before. So we can be pretty concentrated over here. And we're going to see how much water it takes to feel comfortable. If you find you're getting way too much paint on your painting, that is where you just add a little bit more water. And most people tend to not have enough water, but I think the key is having enough water in here or on your brush. But let's take a go at it and see how it works out. So we're going to do the same thing and work from left to right. And so I'm using the Artigria round 10 for wetting, although I have an 8 here too that I might pick up if I need it. And then I have my number 6 round Simply Simmons. I do like the Simply Simmons because it holds a little less water. It tends to give me a bit more control, but you know, you can work with a softer brush that holds more water and just kind of adjust for the amount of water that the brush is holding. But we're going to go ahead and wet the shapes, and this time, instead of wetting every single shape, we're going to do every second shape so that we maintain some of our nice crisp lines. So I'm going to wet this first petal, and then I will wet this one. They do touch, yes, a little bit right there, but that's okay. I'm going to just, I think I'll get away with wetting it. So I'll put water here, and maybe I'll just wet those 2 shapes for now, and then we'll kind of work our way around and just wet as we go. All right, so I have my very concentrated paint. Let's go here. This is almost like it's just barely moistened. So let's just try this. Let's see if we use pretty much concentrated paint, maybe a little bit. You can see there's hardly any water in my palette at all. There's some water in my brush. Let's just see how it works. Let's try and go around the very edge of this and kind of drop that paint in. Oh yeah, we're fine. We could even be more concentrated if we want it to be. So let's take even more paint on the brush and drop that around the very edge. You can see we're almost like pure paint straight from the tube. And kind of go around here. You can see I didn't get that quite wet there, so I've got that little gap. That's okay. I can drop a little more water in there in a minute. I'm just gonna fill in the edges with this nice vibrant pink, and then I can move it around, get some control happening here. Put a little bit more of this. Now this is where having a second brush would be handy, because I can guide it with the second brush without having to wash this one. So let's see. I don't have a number 6, another number 6, so I'll just take my 8 and see if I can do the control with it. Usually I can, we'll see. So I just got water on this one. Let's see if I can guide this paint downwards and get some of these nice creases and folds happening. You can see I've just got beautiful amount of bleed kind of in here, and very, very, very concentrated paint at the edges, and just using my wet brush, wash and dry it as I need to guide that paint around. So yeah, you can see I'm pretty much using paint straight out of the tube. Let's go ahead and do this one. Now I'm not sure if I'm going to be happy with how the join is happening right here, so I might wait and do that little tweak after. Let's just go ahead and paint the edge of this one. And you can kind of have a little bit of a bumpy jitteriness to yourself, or to your, here, let's just bring this into the camera. Okay, very concentrated paint here. Anyways, you can, I started to see, you can kind of let yourself have a little bit of the case of the shakes as you come around the edge, so you get a ruffled kind of petal. So just do what works for you here. Okay, I'm very concentrated there. I've got tons of paint on my brush, almost too much. I'm going to guide it around with my water brush here in a quick minute, but let's just drop this on. You can see because the shape is wet, everything's just bleeding beautifully, and I'm really happy with that. This particular painting lends itself, or I should say this photo, lent itself really well to these techniques of working wet on wet and being very concentrated. So this is what we're doing today, but we will talk about working wet on dry, and you'll see I'm a little less concentrated in that case. Just guiding it with my water brush now. Again, my water brush is just another brush, but it's water instead of pigment. I think I'm happy with that. I actually, you know what I'm not happy with, is that I've dragged my paint down a little lower than I need to, and I've lost that beautiful white. So let's just lift a little bit right here and here, so we can get some of our whites back. So to do that, I'm just washing my brush, drying my brush, and then lifting. You can even lift by just dabbing it like that a little bit too. You can see that removed some of the pigment. Happier with that. I don't want to lose my lights in the process of getting my darks on here, right? And that can happen. Might even drop a little bit of water up here. I'm almost getting like a coloring book line there, so I'll just drop some water, and that's going to encourage it to just flow a little bit more. And lift a little bit more here because it's still a bit too pink. Let's try with this one. taking some paint. I want to see how it works if I take that paint and work wet on wet, but take the paint straight, basically straight out of the tube, right? So you've got this mixture here that I have where it's, well, just my blob of paint right here where I haven't really added much for water. I just want to see how it works. I think it's going to maybe be a bit too concentrated, but I have a little water on my brush. So I just want to see. Let's see if we can say you can take it straight from the tube while it's still wet, or if that's going to be a little too intense. Okay, the edge is working okay. Right here, it's clearly dry, and that's why I got that hard edge. Just put a little bit of water. I actually don't mind that hard edge there. I'll be very careful as I come in with the water because it's going to just go poof. Okay, there. And yeah, it's working. So you can see I'm pretty much straight out of the tube here. I'm going to have to add more water to kind of get that flowing downwards. But you can see you can kind of get away with almost like perfectly concentrated paint. Just kind of drop this in here, a little bit along the edge here. I think I like that. And then we can just, you can decide with your water brush. I'm going to dry mine a little bit and see if I can guide some of these down here and get some of the texture, or I can use my brush as this is drying. Once this is more damp, I think it's maybe a smidge wet, but as it gets damper, it's actually working. I can kind of create some of these creases and folds that I see in the reference photo. I can create some of those with my brush. So I can just gently do that. And if I'm not happy with any of them, I can kind of just tweak them with my water brush and guide them around a little bit so they have a little bit more of a controlled look. Again, as I drag myself down here, I find the tendency is to almost like lose my whites. Just dab that out a little bit. Of course, you saw how I used fresh paint when I did some of these flower petals, but even more so is when we make a nice dark mixture like I've done for this background here. It takes more work to try and rehydrate dry paints. And so when you want to have a nice deep color or a nice rich intense color, just go straight to those paint tubes and take extra paint out. It'll make the color mixing process so much more smooth. In next week's video, I'm going to be showing you how I mix colorful, beautiful blacks using my primaries. And for that, I took fresh paint. That way, when I wanted to start mixing color, the paint was already moist and it was so much easier to get nice, rich, saturated, deep blue and black mixtures. If you want to see how I paint that background, stay tuned because that will be coming next week. But you can also find that on my Etsy shop, an over 90-minute video where I complete the entire painting and you can follow along with me step by step. I hope these tips were helpful and that this video brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye.